Well, good afternoon and welcome to the first of our fall 2025 Kessler Conversations, which are interviews with top scholars of the early modern period connected to topics that are facing contemporary communities. My name is Bo Adams, and I have the great privilege of serving as director of Pitt's Theology Library, which is the home of the Richard C. Kessler Reformation Collection. Now, perhaps no topic facing communities today is as prevalent in the news as the rise of artificial intelligence and the impact new technologies are having on teaching, on learning, and on society more broadly. And so this fall, we are focusing our programming on new technology under the title Reforming Intelligence, AI, and the Legacy of the Reformation. Now, of course, Luther and his contemporaries lived and worked in a world that is far different from ours. But I feel strongly that there is much that we can learn from studying the role technology played in the turbulent period of the 16th century. And I think, as we'll learn today, our new technologies have a role to play in helping us understand that period. Today, I am joined by Dr. Drew Thomas of the University College Dublin. Dr. Thomas is a historian of early modern material culture and the history of communication in the Holy Roman Empire during the Protestant Reformation and the German Renaissance. Dr. Thomas currently works as Research Ireland Pathway Fellow in the School of History at University College, where he leads the digital humanities project called Visualizing Faith, Print, Piety, and Propaganda, which I suspect we will discuss today. And Dr. Thomas is also the author of the 2022 book, The Industry of Evangelism, Printing for the Reformation in Martin Luther's Wittenberg, which I can highly recommend as a librarian as a great way to understand the role technology and industry played in Luther's work, and in turn, the impact that Luther himself had on technology and industry. I should also note that Drew was part of our inaugural cohort of Kessler Fellows here at Pitt's Theology Library, and so he has worked directly with many of the items in our collection. So, Drew, thank you so much for taking the time today, and of course, thank you so much for the work that you do. So, I want to just kind of start, but before we get into artificial intelligence and machines and computers and all that stuff, let's start a little bit with your training and research before the machines. So, Drew, let me ask if you can tell us a little bit about your research trajectory and the work that you've done to kind of get you to this point.
Thank you, Bo, for having me. It's great to be here to discuss my research. I always like coming back to the Pitt's library, so to speak. Um, I'm really happy to be here and to share my research. And I wish I could bring you everywhere and give me an introduction like that every time I had to speak. So thanks for that. So my research, although I'm currently based at University College Dublin, I'm actually I'm not too far from Atlanta at heart. I'm from Memphis, Tennessee originally, um, but now I'm over in Dublin. And when I was in high school in Memphis, I came from a Protestant background, and I went to a Catholic high school. Um, so in many ways, the differences between Protestants and Catholics has always been interesting for me since I was in high school. And this continued throughout my higher education, all the way to my PhD, where I was focusing on Reformation history. And today, my research still focuses on Reformation history, the history of the book, and especially how religious ideas were communicated through print. So Martin Luther started the Reformation. He had these ideas that he spread from the pulpit, but how did they spread further afield physically through the printed book? Um, I've also always been interested in how people saw faith and how visual media like woodcuts or borders on title pages or illustrations in catechisms shaped devotion and in polemics. So my earlier work really involved traditional archival research, going around library to library, looking at these old books, handling the rare books, tracing printers and publishers. And over time, I really became fascinated by the patterns of reuse. So when a printer prints a book with movable type in this time period, they have to put all the little pieces of type on the press and pull the printing press to print the pages. But if you wanted an illustration, you would hire an artist to carve you a wood block, and you could put that wood block on the press as well. And that's how you would print illustrations. But printers would reuse these blocks across lots of different books, and they would sell their stock from one print shop to the next. So I like to trace these patterns of reuse, especially for identifying anonymous books or counterfeit books, which was a lot of my work at the Kessler collection at Emory was tracing counterfeit copies in the Kessler collection of books by Luther, printed by printers elsewhere, but were pretending to be from Wittenberg, where he was. Um, and that curiosity of these patterns naturally led towards computational approaches.
Yeah, no, we loved having you work on our stuff, although we didn't want you to discover counterfeits in our collection. So no way. Um, but let's talk a little bit about your transition into kind of using machines. So I presume you're not a software developer. You weren't trained as a software developer. And I think for a lot of us, when we kind of think about computational methods in the kind of study of text, part of it is, well, I don't know how to program a computer, so how am I going to do that? But clearly you've made this transition and you've been able to use these tools, and we'll talk about kind of the impact of that. But can you tell us a little bit about that transition into using technology, how you learned AI, how you learned the technology skills that were necessary to do the kind of work that you're doing now?
Yeah, absolutely. You are correct. I am not a software engineer. I've never received any formal training in coding or design. In fact, I didn't even use artificial intelligence at all until after my PhD. But I have always been a person interested in technology. Even in junior high and high school, I kind of taught myself how to build websites, code with HTML. So I've always kind of dabbled in that sense. Um, when I started my PhD, I joined a large digital humanities project called the Universal Short Title Catalog, which a lot of that required looking at databases of like library catalogs. And I had no experience in databases or anything. And so I learned a lot by doing. And then afterwards, after I finished my PhD and moved on, I did a project with my colleague Sandy Wilkinson here in Dublin called Ornamento. And we were interested in studying illustrations used in early modern books. And in order to do that, the first thing you need to know is which books have illustrations. You think that would be an easy question to answer, but not. And so we turned to computational ways, such as AI, for doing this. And a lot of this was just using tools that were already built that we could learn how to use. We're not doing the groundbreaking research of the discovery of how AI works. Um, but as AI breakthroughs happen and they get developed into tools that other people can use, I learned to use those. And I will say, with the advent of large language models, such as ChatGPT and other ones, this really lowers the barrier of entry into this type of work, because you can really use it for educational purposes to explain complex tasks simply when it comes to coding. And I use it every day in my work in that manner.
Yeah. So, I mean, you talked about kind of your early work, where, as you described it, kind of the old school, going to libraries, looking at images, flipping through books, finding the images.
Mhm.
Um, let's talk a little bit about how machine learning algorithms have enhanced your research. So, what have you been able to accomplish with the machines that, an earlier Drew Thomas or the kind of quote normal Reformation scholar wouldn't be able to do? Is this simply about scale and being more efficient, or are there things that the machines can do or insights that you found based on the machines that you wouldn't have been able to find otherwise?
Right. Yes, I would say the answer to that is both. It is about scale, but it's also about asking new questions and new interpretations. So originally, there's a chapter in my book about title page borders, and I was really interested in how printers decorated their title pages of their books, because printers in other cities outside of Wittenberg would copy these. So I was really interested in that. And I remember physically printing out like photocopies of these borders and creating piles on my desk and chairs and the floor around me and doing this stuff manually. Um, Never would I have imagined only a few years later I would be able to make a gigantic leap forward in this type of work. Um, Libraries have spent the last 2 decades or longer scanning their books. This costs a lot of money, costs a lot of labor and time, and it's great because now scholars don't have to travel halfway across the world to look at books. But now that these books exist as a digital object, you can do things with that digital object that you cannot do with the book sitting on the shelf. Um, and so by using AI tools such as object detection to identify pages with illustrations in early modern books, or using image matching software to group instances of the same illustration being used in multiple books, it allows us to see patterns at scale that no single scholar could notice manually. Um, this allows me to trace circulation of imagery across Protestants and Catholics or different geographical boundaries. Um, in my current project, I've even extended this by using vision language models, which basically what that means is if I have a corpus of, let's say, 1 million images, and I want to know which images depict Jesus, before I would need to manually go through and tag each image that has Jesus in it. And when I do a search for Jesus, it finds all the images with the tag of Jesus. But now, with vision language models, we can index all of these images and search the content of them without having tagged them. So now I can ask, find me images that depict Jesus, and it will display usable, valuable results, even though the manual labor of going through them and tagging them is no longer there. Um,
Can I ask just
so,
in
yeah,
the
yeah,
Um, so the downside of the tagging method obviously is it takes forever and
yeah.
requires human labor. But the upside of that, of course, is you can guarantee some kind of precision. I can take your work and know that you've done a good job. I'm curious when
Mm.
you find the tools now, obviously much more efficient to ask the machine to do it. Is it as good as the human tagger?
The answer is sometimes it's better. Um, I mean, it also depends on who's doing the tagging. Because when it comes to cataloging early modern religious woodcuts, that does require a large amount of specialist knowledge. So it can um, be better of somebody who doesn't have that specialist understanding. Um, However, you're right when it comes to statistically. If I've tagged, let's say that 1 million images, that's 100,000 of Jesus. If I search for the Jesus tag, I get 100,000 results. In this vision language model, maybe I only get 950,000 results. Or so not all of them. So there is a trade-off. But one other thing I've been working on is not just having artificial intelligence catalog it, but maybe artificial intelligence can apply those standardized classification systems onto the image corpus for us. And I've seen great results for that. Um, but at the same time, human validation is still going to be necessary. So if I no longer have to start from step one, if AI can get me to the last step or the next to last step, and then I use my specialist knowledge to make that final depiction. Maybe it can't tell me which classification it should be, but it can give me the top 10 most likely results. And then I can go in and say, that's it. That saves a lot of time in our research pipeline.
So, I mean, I think it's fair to say that you're not the only person using AI to read old books, but as you describe your work, it's not exactly typical for contemporary Reformation scholarship. So let me ask you to kind of zoom out a little bit. Can you place yourself within kind of what's happening in Reformation studies? How prevalent is this? And then kind of the harder question, where's this going to go? What is this going to allow us to do that we haven't been able to do for centuries of study?
Right. So, of course, many scholars are using traditional methodologies. And you go to the archives, you look at the books, and that's perfect. Um, it's not a one size fits all for methodology. You need to look at your research question. What question are you asking? What is the best way to solve it? Maybe the best way to solve it isn't using AI. Um, if I only have 100 images to classify, do I really need to use AI? Can't I just sit down and spend a day or two or a week or so doing that? Um, I would say yes. But we're also at a moment where AI can read both text and image, and that's really is transforming fields like Reformation studies, especially where the visual and verbal are deeply intertwined. So I can see in the near future a time where every digitized early modern book becomes machine searchable, whether or not that's in the search or in the image. Um, so I do think it will help in terms of findability. If at the end of the day, this helps put scholars in front of the books that they've been having so much difficulty finding, now that they've been found, they can use their traditional tools and answer them in traditional ways.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. It both expands the corpus, but also makes the corpus more discoverable, or it leads, as you say, the scholar to the particular text that he or she needs to work with, and maybe didn't even know existed or didn't previously have direct access to. Can I just ask maybe a technical or specific question? When you talk about these tools, like when you talk about tools that use language to find images, are these like specialized, super expensive tools that no one has access to except Drew Thomas? Or are these, general large language models that people can use? Which tools are you actually using?
Right. Um, well, mixtures. Yes, large language models, such as OpenAI, which is what powers ChatGPT, or Gemini. Um, when it comes to everyday tasks, there could be a simple task of I have a CSV file with this metadata, and I have this folder of images. I want to somehow link those, and I can ask a large language model, hey, can you write me a little Python script? This is what my CV file looks like. This is an example of my folder of images. Can you write me a Python script that links this together for me? And it'll do it. Or maybe it doesn't work. Maybe there's an error. So I just copy and paste the error, say this is the error. But like, oh, you got that error? Let me try it again. And it works. In the past, it would have taken me days or a week of searching online forums and trial and error to find the right way. So there's that tool. Now, when it comes to image tools, um, there's a lot of tools I use from the virtual, or rather the visual geometry group at the University of Oxford has developed lots of image tools for image matching or for object detection. So they've done a great job at taking machine learning tools and developing them in a way for scholars in the humanities to use. So definitely check out there. For OCR and transcription, Transcribus is a very popular software for you can train your own models or use pre-trained models on deciphering printed text or handwriting. So that's really a big up and coming field. So there are a lot of tools that are free and cost money. So there's an entry point for all sorts of different levels.
Yeah. And there does seem to be a general, I mean, you mentioned, for example, the visual geometry, like there's an interest in creating tools that everyone can use, right? It's not like these are for-profit corporations that are creating the stuff that they then want to put behind a paywall. A lot of these tools, as they develop, are open and available for people to use. Is that correct?
Correct. The virtual geometry group, or the sorry, visual geometry group, their tools are open source and free to use. Other tools like Transcribus operate on a freemium model where, maybe you can do a certain amount of things for free. And then if you want to do stuff at scale, you might need to purchase some credits. Um, I mean, we all know this stuff isn't cheap to process. And when it comes to scholarly university projects, there's always the fear of longevity that you'll create this great tool, but then once the grant runs out, the website disappears because there's no more money to keep the website running. So that is a problem we have to think about as well.
Yeah. You and I talked a little bit earlier, and I'm kind of curious your thoughts here. One of the exciting things is that these tools are getting better every day, right? And new tools are popping up. That can be a problem for a scholar, though, who has to choose a methodology, choose a way of approaching, publish, these kinds of things. So, how do you balance the excitement of new tools and new methods and everything happening all the time with the kind of traditional scholarly problem of, freezing your research at a particular point in time?
Yeah, it's hard. A new model comes out and you just like, I wonder. I wonder if it could do it better. Kind of want to try it, but I still need, sometimes you just gotta say no because you need to write the book. But also think about an undergraduate student writing an essay. They might want to write an essay that solves the world's problems, but you're not going to be able to do that in a semester. And so you got to put some guardrails up. Okay, well, let's focus on this place and this time period and focus on that. Or maybe I do a lot of studying of early modern counterfeiting. And I would love, I've got a list of libraries in my head, but I would love to visit all of them and look at these collections and do all that. But at the same time, that might take me years and years. Maybe I need to focus on one, two, three libraries that I know I'll be able to visit and see the material and do it that way. So a lot of that can be applied to the new technologies as well. Um, Technology is always going to get better. But just because there's new technology, I mean, old technology still might be very good at doing the task that you need it to do. So there's no harm in still doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't want to transition too far in the negative, but I do tend to be a cynic by nature. So I want to kind of talk about the downsides or maybe some of the
Hmm.
critiques of using technology, right? So you could imagine, for example, that a critic would worry about offloading learning to machines, which could result in less training and these kinds of things. I mean, you are in some sense a hybrid, right? You trained as a traditional textual scholar, and then you started to use these tools. So maybe a critic might say, well, people aren't going to have to learn Latin anymore. They're not going to have to learn German anymore. So what downsides to using machines do you see? Or are there actual challenges or are critics right in some case to be concerned about how much of this work is being offloaded to the machine?
Yes, I'm of the opinion that um, these machines shouldn't be replacing us. AI should free us to ask better historical questions, not to skip the hard work of learning the languages or reading carefully. Um, AI will allow us to make connections that we previously couldn't. So it will allow us to ask questions that in the past we never would have thought of asking. So I do think it's very good that way. Now, of course, there is a danger that lots of these models only reflect the data that they're trained on. So if our digitized collections are incomplete or they're biased, those biases get amplified. So we do have to um, be critical about what these are trained on, and recognize if our answers that we're getting from these tools are being biased likewise. There's also, of course, the danger of over trusting machine outputs. In my case, classifying early modern woodcuts, danger of accepting every classification or translation as truth rather than as a suggestion that still needs interpretation. At the end of the day, the scholar is responsible for all of their work that they're doing. But I also think of it like when it comes to linguistic skills, especially because what happens when we get to a point where we can translate all of this stuff easily from any language to any language? Should we still learn languages? And I feel like it goes back to older debates. Like, if you're a theologian and you're writing theology, especially biblical criticism, do you have to know Koine Greek, Aramaic, Hebrew, and Latin? Do you need to know all of those perfectly? Or or is there a group of scholarship where the answer to that question is yes, they do. But there's other questions where you don't, because those aren't the questions that you're focusing on. Um, so I do think the answer is yes and no. But I also think even for people that have the skills, maybe they're really good at translating, but maybe it's a lot difficult to find the books they need to translate. But if they could find it in a language they're familiar with, and that gets them in front of the book, then they can use their specialized linguistic skills to really dive into the details. I think that's a great thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think oftentimes this gets talked about as like offloading the work so that we don't have to do as much work. But as you've described it, it's offloading the work to open the time and opportunity to do different work or more specialized work. And I think when you see the tools as kind of partners in scholarship, right, they can do some of
Mm.
the work, but then that frees you up to do more. Not, Drew Thomas can just take it easy now because the machines are doing the research. Rather, now Drew Thomas can use the machines to free up his specialized skill, to ask new questions or to discover new texts. And I think in that
Yeah.
model, the machines are just like any other kind of tool. You might think of it as like a concordance or a lexicon, right? They are tools that allow you or free up your time to do different kinds of things.
Absolutely, because that is um something you hear, oh, you do AI so that the computers do all the work for you. And it's like, no, no, they do not. Either it's me spending crazy amount of hours validating the outputs, making sure everything's correct. Or, like you said, it allows me to offload work to focus on the research. I especially think about this when it comes to the sciences and fields that maybe traditionally are stereotyped as not being the best at communicating their research. If they can now focus on the research, but they have tools that allow them to communicate it in a much better way than they previously have, I think that's a great thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I mean, that speaking about communication, I think gets us into the kind of broader question of some of the concern people have about these tools. And that is, of course, are the tools being used to create knowledge, to write for us, or to kind of do things that the person should do? So let me ask you a very unfair question. So I'll just upfront say that and ask you to play the role of kind of prophet and guide for the rest of us. I mean, I think the challenge is sometimes you read headlines in the newspaper and it's like AI tools are here and they're going to cure every disease. They're going to create income for everybody so that we don't have to work. The greatest savior, of the world. And then the next day you open up the newspaper and the machines are making us dumb. We're never going to know how to think or write anymore. Eventually the machines will take over, the kind of naysayer side of this. So again, an unfair question. Where do you sit generally on machine learning AI and kind of the cultural implications? And then maybe more specifically within an educational context, how do you think about these tools as part of the training for the next generation within a kind of higher education world? How do your students approach these?
Yeah. Hmm. Well, first off, I think we're now in the phase where to the general public, AI is ChatGPT. It's all about writing essays and things like that. But you can use that tool for so much more than just writing essays, just like I said, or writing code or having it do lots of anything that's a task with lots of repetition. It's very good at that type of stuff. But overall, I am, I'd say, cautiously optimistic. Um, for me, AI is a tool, and just like the printing press in the 16th century, it's transforming communication, and it will likely transform communication just like the printing press in ways that we can't yet predict. I do think the Reformation is a useful, I guess, analogy in this sense, because the Reformation was really the coming of age of the printing press. It was Europe's first mass media event. This idea that the printing press was going to democratize knowledge, but it also ended up spreading misinformation and polemic. And I think we can argue AI is doing something similar today. Actually, before AI, we already know we have problems with misinformation and disinformation on social media. And AI is only going to enhance that even more. Um, but I think the key question isn't whether AI is good or bad, but it's how we use it. Whether we build systems that amplify our understanding or systems that distort it. And so, in this sense, I believe that our perspectives as humans are essential here, and historians, we see the long view. We've seen technological revolutions before. Um, but I'm an optimist that, I mean, AI is here to stay. So when it comes to the classroom and things like that, I think about, well, it's students that no longer had to use a card catalog and could use a digital catalog. Did they have an unfair advantage? Um, the difference, though, is you still had to do a lot of the work. Some people, the fear is that large language models will do the work for you. And I do think that means we have to rethink our assessment in the classroom. Um, I think assessment needs to be redesigned, not so that we're policing AI, but so that we're validating the goals of our pedagogy. So we're going to have to find new ways to assess whether students have learned the material while at the same time recognizing that they have these new incredible tools at their disposal.
Yeah, let me take us in a slight side path, but I think it's important. You raised it, so it's your fault. You talked about looking at the 16th century as a kind of historical parallel. And in some sense, I'm jealous of you because you get to use these new tools, but you also use them on a period that was a period of rapid technological innovation. And so you have in your mind the cultural implications that new technologies can have. So, what kind of insights, and again, this has been my kind of hobby horse for a while, that there are great insights that we can learn about the ways in which technology shaped for good or bad culture in the 16th century. What are the kind of key insights that you learned from that historical period that might help us kind of understand what's going to happen or what choices we have in light of this new technology?
Well, I mean, one great example is my work on counterfeits of Luther's works. So Luther lived in Wittenberg. He would publish a book there. The printers were his friends. They would publish his books, and printers in other towns would get a copy of it and reprint their own copy of Luther's book. That's normal. There was no copyright back then. That's how the trade worked. But many printers took it a step further and falsely printed that those books were printed in Wittenberg. Um, and Luther would get mad about this, possibly because it cost his friends money. Um, but he would write, there's so many errors in these other works that I can't possibly be credited as the author of those books. And you do get a lot of polemic and misinformation at this time. So even back then, it was noticed like you have to be skeptical of your source material. You know, always be questioning, always be questioning where your source material is coming from. I think that's a great lesson we've learned. I think another lesson is printing vastly expanded the amount of books in circulation. And so even in the 16th century, we were dealing with what today we might term information overload. And you really see libraries start to develop ways to not combat it, but help us with the information overload. You know, card catalogs were a huge innovation. Um, Electronic catalogs, microfilm. You know, microfilm is going to revolutionize libraries. You can fit the whole newspapers of the whole country in a filing cabinet. Um, so um, I do think AI will help as well because in this online age of even more information overload, it is going to play a very important role allowing us to sift through all the information to find the material we need. I mean, search and retrieval is one of the biggest problems of our time. And when it comes to images and visual media, you can argue it's only now that we're able to search this stuff from the 16th century in meaningful ways.
Yeah. So you've mentioned libraries a few times, so we have to talk about libraries for just a second. I think it's an easy thing to say, Drew, you have been the beneficiary of great work by libraries, and I don't think you will deny that. And I will say in particular, the German libraries, which have done a remarkable amount of digitization of the source material that you work with. And so while I think we often hear the narrative of libraries are not as important anymore, libraries are dying, these kinds of things, your research, even though it is not traditional textual scholarship, makes the argument, I think, that libraries in their new form, um, need more funding and need more resources. So can you talk a little bit about the importance of libraries for your work and where you think libraries can actually do more to create more opportunities for people like you to do the kind of research you're doing?
None of this, what I do, what OpenAI does, what Google does, what Meta does, none of this would be possible without libraries. Um, the ability to train or test algorithms depends entirely on the existence of available text. And you know, it's one thing for a company like OpenAI to download all the websites in the world and train it on that text, but you run out and then you go to books. Where are the books? They're in the libraries. The existence of these high quality digitized collections isn't really important, but also not just the scans, but the metadata, all of the catalog information about that is very difficult. And actually, you know, I just in my answer, I mentioned microfilm. Microfilm was huge technology that we can now, a small town library that doesn't have the resources to have a great collection can buy a copy of a microfilm library, and now their patrons can come and view it. Well, what did we find out? Microfilm deteriorates over time. Um, and now that we have all these great digital scans, these libraries are no longer buildings sitting with books. They're libraries are not passive partners in my research. They're very much active partners. And you have all these scanned books on hard drives. It's cost a lot of money to preserve that material, to serve it to all the users across the world that want to use it. Just like that microfilm deteriorates, you need to replace your hard drives every few years because the hardware and equipment that all these computer files sit on also deteriorate over time. So it's a constant game of preservation. Preservation is not a, oh, we preserved it and let it sit. It's a constant activity, which costs a lot of money. Um, Projects like mine rely on this types of partnerships with libraries that supply the data. And so in many ways, I think one way libraries are shifting is they're being the ones providing the services, they're being the ones providing the tools, and more importantly, libraries are opening up back doors to their data sets. For example, I know the Austrian National Library in Vienna, they their abbreviation for their library is the ONB, but they have a page called ONB Labs, and you go to there, and it has tutorials on how to access the catalog at scale, how to here's the data sets they have available, how can you use them, and I think the more that libraries make those available, it's more likely that their collections are going to be the ones chosen to be used.
Yeah, that was a wonderful endorsement of libraries. We very much appreciate. We'll keep doing the work. So thank you, Drew. Let me ask you, as we kind of move toward closing here, to predict the future a little bit around your particular scholarship. What are the kind of big dreams and visions that you see now that are actually might be possible on the horizon because we have these tools? I mean, will we get to a point where all of the images you're looking for are available, described, easily accessed? I mean, kind of where are we heading in the next few years?
Well, I don't think we'll ever get to all the books because different institutions have different amounts of funding. For example, you said Germany has done a great job at digitizing their books. They have, but that's revolved really around the three or four leading libraries that have large collections. Um, And so let me dream a little bit. And actually, some of my dreams are now becoming realities. But I think the next big leap forward in historical scholarship will be when all of these digitized books become text searchable. When you're able to search it like Google, and that allows you to find the books that you might have never found before. I think that's big. For my work on images, um, you'll be able to search images and find them. You'll be able to search the content of these images, which will allow us to have new questions. Um, Another example of questions that you would have never asked before. But now that all these libraries are scanning the libraries, now it's not just, oh, well, Berlin has a copy of this book. Well, Emory has another copy of that book. Why do we need two copies of the same book? Well, maybe they have different information from the ownership history. And that's a lot of the work I did with my fellowship at the Pitts Theology Library with the Kessler collection was looking at the ownership history of these books. I'm interested in counterfeits of Luther's books. When did these historical owners realize that these books were counterfeit? Or did they believe these were original first editions from Wittenberg? So what notes did they write in their book? These are types of questions that would have been very difficult to ask before this age where we can start making these connections.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the default answer is libraries just need to digitize everything. And on the one hand, that's true. But I think just digitizing everything, as you've pointed out, doesn't necessarily get us where we need to be, right?
Right.
To both digitize, you have to have good quality metadata, and you have to make your collections accessible and available at scale, right? So it's not just Drew clicking one website after another. It's Drew's ability to take that entire data set and learn something about it at scale. And that's really the kind of next level where I think libraries are not just about preserving physical objects. They're kind of centers of information, right? And
Mm.
the data sets that allow scholars like you to kind of do the work that you need to do. So
Yeah, we think of these institutions as buildings that hold the books and preserve the past, but really they're living, breathing institutions. And I kind of think of it like window washers on a skyscraper. As soon as you finish washing every window, you got to start over. A lot of these early digitization campaigns, if they were lucky enough to have a microfilm collection, they didn't actually scan the books to digitize them for the internet. They just scanned the microfilm. which is a great first step, but they're usually very poor quality. And as soon as you do a high scan, well, the high scan in 20 years from now will, I'm sure, be a lot better and allow us to do even cooler, newer things that we can't even dream of right now. And so it is always a target that's moving forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you have your work cut out for you, but I think we also as well have our work cut out for us. And I mean, to a point you made earlier, libraries and scholars have to be seen as partners in this research, not just libraries provide stuff and scholar does the work, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I email librarians or the people in the tech department of librarians all the time asking, say, hey, I'm trying to get access of this data. Can you help me? And they're always willing.
You always find out libraries are always nice, ready to help. Yeah, so that's good to hear. Yeah. Well, we are running out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and cut us off. But I want to thank Dr. Thomas mainly for his work because I do encourage you to check it out. It is really interesting. And Drew, I don't know if there are particular pieces of work or scholarship that you want to kind of plug moving forward. But I think it is really exciting and really accessible for people to understand the kind of work you're doing.
Well, you can check out my website, drewbthomas.com. Lots of my research is posted there if you want to get an idea or read it or search for more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know Drew has a lot of exciting things on the horizon, so we will keep our eye there and learn what's coming on. I look forward to sharing this conversation. So, like we do always, we will edit the recording and get it up online so you can share it with folks that you want to. And I also want to remind you that the AI Fund has only begun this semester. So, this is the first of 3 Kessler conversations all around this general topic of exploring how scholars are using these tools to ask new questions of texts. So in 2 weeks, we'll talk with Giles Bergdahl of the University of Oxford. You mentioned the Oxford folks before, so we'll learn a little bit about the work they're doing. And then 2 weeks after that, the first Wednesday of December, we will talk with Serena Strecker of Yale University. And both of these folks, like Drew, are using machines to study text in new and interesting ways. So I hope you'll visit us online and register for these conversations. Thank you again, Drew. It's wonderful to catch up and hear about your work, and we look forward to seeing more.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, have a great day.